Chapel Hill that's the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is an arch rival of Duke in basketball.
Yeah.
They take that very
In,
seriously. So
in different
I live in
periods. Yeah. You're in the area, nice part of the world. I've been to both schools at different times, and I always forget where everything is. Hey,
yeah.
let me
But
introduce you properly.
Sure.
We are doing our thing here. We're live streaming on YouTube, and this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And my guest today is Professor Jeffrey W. Swanson. And do we do Jeffrey or Jeff?
Just call me Jeff. My friends call me Jeff.
And Jeff Swanson is a professor in psychiatry and behavioral science at Duke University School of Medicine. He's a faculty affiliate of the Wilson Center for Science and Justice at Duke Law School as well, the Center for Firearms Law at Duke Law School, and the Center for Child and Family Policy at Duke Sanford School of Public Policy. And I've been reading a lot of your papers, Jeff, related to gun violence and the law, both from a kind of a psychiatric point of view, but also just in terms of where we stand. And I wanted to start with something that I'm going to just see if I can call up here and read a little quote. It isn't the reference that you sent me today, but it's one that comes, I think it's pretty recent. And it's Preventing Firearms Tragedy by the Numbers, Remembering Why It Matters. And this appeared in JAMA, J-A-M-A. What's JAMA stand for anyway?
That stands for the Journal of the American Medical Association.
That's it. And that's June 12, 2024. So it's pretty recent. But the thing that got my attention was the kind of personal note at the beginning. And I think actually it's a good place to start. So I'm going to read this.
Sure.
And this is by Jeff, and kind of introduces his subject, in which he is an academic and a scholar and an expert. And by the way, was referred to us by a friend of ours we've interviewed who's written for the New York Times for 30 years. And when we finished our interview with her on public health and policy, we asked her if she had some other people to recommend, and you were one of them. So that's why we're talking today. The sound of my grandmother's trembling voice lingers from that winter morning almost 40 years ago now, when she called with awful news. My beautiful cousin, Kristen, had come home from college for the holidays and killed herself with a shotgun. Kristen was a decade my junior, a homecoming princess, and a talented pianist with a mischievous smile and whimsical sense of humor. To me, she was like a little sister. But for reasons unknown, persistent feelings of sadness and despair crept in and took root in her mind. 5 days before Christmas, Uncle Jim found her beside the garbage. She had left a note saying she wanted to be with God. And that's a kind of a poignant way. It's very sort of wonderfully untypical of what normally appears at the front end of academic papers, and immediately got my attention. I've read a number of the things that my producer, Ernie Gregg, has sent me to read, but I thought I would start with a personal question. You know, this is your field and you're so well known in it, but you tell this story, and I was wondering if you regard that as really why you have zeroed in on this, because obviously that stayed with you. And I guess the second part of that question is, having begun to examine that, did you first come through the legal question of firearms in the hands of suicidal people and what to do about that, or the psychological and psychiatric question of what happened to your family member? And then, hey, what could we do about this? So before we get into the issue, I thought I would ask you to delve a little bit into that story, but also amplify it, how it led you into this field.
Great place to start. So I'm a sociologist by training, and I do a lot of empirical sociological work. And so the coin of the realm and the rhetoric of persuasion is statistics about populations. And I think about these problems as population public health problems. But, at the core of any statistic, if it's about people, about persons, is a story. And it's often, if this is the topic, it's a story of a young person whose life is cut short and a loved one's left behind. And each of them is a tragedy in its own right. It just rips through families and communities across generations. So I began the essay about that because I wanted people, it's about the number needed to treat and so on. I wanted people to think about that one individual and how that person was close to me. Because no one is more than 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from a gun violence story. It's a very personal thing. So, I wanted to start that way, but I've also found it to be true, that lots of people who are researchers and advocates and are involved in the world of gun violence prevention have a story like this. And I've talked to lots of them. And it's probably true that many academics, social scientists, there is a connection, if you scratch the surface, between their personal biography and what they decide to study. And so, that's why I did it. I came to this through a sort of circuitous route as a sociologist, and I could tell you about that if you want to. But I think of it as firearm-related injury and mortality is a huge public health problem. We talk about it when there's a mass shooting, but on that day, 130, 40 other people die every day as a result of the gunshot. And so I wanted to bring to bear as a social scientist, and I could tell you the pathway I got there, research evidence to try to develop and to study interventions, policies, and laws to try to solve this problem. And it's a really tough one in our country for reasons we can discuss. But I have not just one, but 3 gun suicide stories in my extended family, and a colleague, at the university I worked at before I came to Duke, who also died of a firearm suicide. And so, it is personal, and the loss is something that, my uncle and aunt, as I say in the essay, I mean, at the end of it, they just never got over that.
Yeah, of course not. And you cite the figure, I think, somewhere, perhaps in that essay or one of the others, of 20,000 suicides by gun a year. And of course, that's such a horrendous number that it's hard to get your head around, let alone all gun deaths a year in the US. And then, of course, the context of our whole discussion, which everyone will know who is listening to this, is, of course, the debate between, first of all, just gun owners, then the NRA and the gun lobby, which are 2 entirely different things often. And then the kind of this political climate of divisiveness on so many issues. And one of the culture war issues is the area of gun violence. So I guess before we get into the specifics of your work, I guess this also is a personal question. How have you handled the fact that the issue you're dealing with on the point of view of sort of sensible legislation, laws, and how things would be engineered in what you might call a non-North American context, say Britain or maybe Switzerland, where I grew up, or country that does not have as part of its culture war, this very large and greedy gun lobby that has sold certain types of firearms to people as a necessity and a right. I guess what I'm trying to ask you here is, how has your own life been lived out as an expert in this field in the midst of the frustration of living in the one culture on earth that is notorious for outright hostility towards everything you would be trying to do in terms of just sensible legislation to prevent suicides, which, by the way, I would bet, and I'll ask you about this later, are not related only to political standing, but cut across all social, economic, and political lines. And so there's as many Republican NRA members who have people suiciding in their families as there would be anybody else. So it's a really long-winded way of just saying, how have you personally, speaking of psychology, how do you personally deal with this Sisyphean task of pushing this rock uphill? Because it would seem to me, having spent so much time and energy trying to do this, and I guess part 3 of this 2-part question is, have you seen enough progress so that you don't get discouraged and so burnt out on readdressing this again and again and again, aside from the personal stories? It must be something that sometimes you're tempted to simply give up on.
Yeah. So let me find my way into that answer by answering a question you didn't quite ask, but it has to do with how I look at the United States as a country.
Yeah.
And so what I was going to tell you is that I didn't grow up in the United States. I grew up in Ecuador as the son of a medical missionary, and who took our country there, our family there, when I was 4 years old. And so I grew up watching my dad. He was a heroic figure. We lived right next to the hospital, taking care of very sick people who would come in, indigenous people. And so I was very aware that the conditions of people's lives were often determining their health problems. So that health and illness and access to health care, these are social phenomena. I thought I wanted to be a doctor like my dad, but in college, I decided to become a medical sociologist. And then I found my way into studying mental illness and eventually violence and mental illness. But I grew up idealizing the United States, thinking of this as, this is this, this amazing Christian country that sent my parents as missionaries to Ecuador. And when I came to the United States for college, and I sort of looked at it at remove, but also sort of in a comparative perspective. And so I was attuned both as a missionary kid and also as someone who became a social scientist into this connection between culture and human behavior and health problems. And I do think of violent behavior and gun violence as a health problem. So, and as a cultural problem as well. I mean, you can't talk about gun violence without talking about private gun ownership in this country.
Yeah.
And once you do, you realize that if you're interested in preventing gun violence, you're dealing with a problem that, I mean, it's not only embedded in our culture and wrapped up in the iconography of our social history. It's corporately sustained. There's lots of money in guns. It's, according to the way our Supreme Court has interpreted it, the Constitution, the right to bear arms, it's constitutionally protected, and it's highly prevalent. We got more guns than we have people in this country.
Yeah.
And as you implied, it's politically radioactive. So you have to deal with this. I mean, I just posted on X the news release to the paper we just published, and you get all of these, comments from people that saying this is junk science, it's garbage, you're taking our guns away. So the way I've tried to deal with it is, and it is a tension between being a researcher producing knowledge and being some kind of an advocate. And what I do is I have alliances with people who are in the world of advocacy and trying to do evidence-based policy. I want to do policy and practice informed research. So I'm studying things that are actually, if I get the answer to that, it's going to have some impact. And so when we came up our group with this policy that's sometimes called red flag laws, what we did is we went around to, groups of us to every single state, and there are now 21 states in DC that have enacted this, and we had public forums. And we talk to people. We try to get people who come from different sides of this issue, people who own guns, and listen to them, and to help people understand, look, this is kind of 1 square inch of common ground. Nobody wants a person who's eminently dangerous to have access to a gun.
Yeah.
But our country is unique, and we need unique solutions. You compare us to like 14, 15 other high-income countries that we like to compare ourselves to, like Western Europe and Canada and the UK and Australia. Yeah. And our crime problem, we don't have an exceptional crime problem. It's kind of right average. We have an exceptional homicide problem because guns are so much more likely to be involved in these, so you look at homicide, and we in the bar graph we look like, looks like the skyline of Burlington, Vermont, with the Empire State Building right in the middle of it, and that's our country. So we have to listen to people, but we have to. I want to trust scientific research, and insofar as we can get people to look at the evidence fairly and do things that work, that don't infringe on the rights of law-abiding, non-dangerous gun owners at all, because the Second Amendment's not going away. We can make some progress. I think we have made some progress. I can talk about the progress I think we've made.
Yeah, and we should get into that. I just want to say again that Cheryl Gay Stolberg, who has been writing on many issues. She was a White House correspondent, and now I think she's either the editor of or the person who does most of the writing on public health policy. She got in touch with me because she knew I'd made a film with Dr. Sierra Coop, and she's got a chapter in a book she's working on him, and needed some background. And I so enjoyed my talk with her that we interviewed her about her life and career at times, and then at the end, we asked her, as I will ask you, hey, who else would you recommend who's doing something interesting? And you were the person. Zeroing on what you just said, we don't have a crime problem, we have a homicide problem. That leads me to a question I wanted to ask in terms of just a comparative number with suicide by guns in other countries as compared to other countries. I imagine it's much less, but in addition to which, obviously people do commit suicide in other countries. If people don't have access to guns, does this drop the number of suicides? Does it drop the number of quote unquote successful suicides? A kind of a weird way to describe someone who manages to kill themselves. Yeah. What's the effect on just the suicide rate, irrespective of method used? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. The likelihood that somebody will die. I mean, there are lots and lots of people who think about suicide, who have suicide life. And a smaller number of them, a far smaller number of them actually try to end their life. And then a much tinier group die. So one of the things that determines whether someone is going to survive a suicide attempt is the method that they use. And on average, if people use, any other common method, they're quite likely to survive. It's on average about 10%. If people use a firearm, they almost never survive because the case fatality rate is about 90%. So, if you have, fewer people, if people don't have access to guns, and they're just the fatality rate from suicide attempts is not going to be as high. That being said, there is this phenomenon of substitution. So if you don't, some people will say, well, hey, it doesn't matter if you take somebody's firearm away or limit their access to that because they'll find some other way to do it. And that is true for some people. But, I'll just give you one example of a study in Switzerland where they made a policy change to that all of the Army Reserve, there's young men, should no longer be storing their firearms at home. So from one year to the next, suddenly you have this population of young men who are in the Army Reserves, and they're no longer storing their gun at home. The overall suicide rate in Switzerland dropped 10% in 1 year. And they were able to calculate statistically what was the substitution effect. And that particular study reported, it was in the American Journal of Psychiatry, reported it was about 22%. So 22% of the young men there who were in some great moment of depression or intoxicated despair and wanted to end their life and did not have the gun, which is the most efficient way probably to end a life, found some other way to do it. But the rest of them did not. And also what we know is if people survive a suicide attempt, they're unlikely to die from suicide. Now, they're more likely than if they'd never tried it. But the majority of people who survive suicide attempts go on and die from something else later in life. So it's a really good public health opportunity there. And it isn't all about access to mental health care to try to reduce, whatever motivates people to self-injurious behavior. That's part of it. It's more related in women actually than men. But for men, the attributable risk, maybe about half, a little more than half, is directly related to like depressive illness that could be treated. The rest of it is due to other things like, just conditions in people's lives or loss or a moment of impulsive, somebody's intoxicated and they have a gun, so.
Well, there's anyway, probably a similar kind of correlation when it comes to domestic violence and people being allowed to keep a weapon who have a habit of beating up on someone in a domestic situation. Again, it seems to me the gun brings a finality to those situations that, wouldn't be there otherwise. And of course, there's that same discussion in and around that, whether you're able to change that situation. And it kind of goes back to the story you tell at the beginning of that one paper, because you mentioned she was 18 and so couldn't buy a handgun because she's not 21 yet, but the gun owner sold her a shotgun instead, which she killed herself
Yeah.
with. And then you go on later in the article and talk about the fact that, had something been in place, if this had been different, and we had something in place, that it might have spared her life. And then you go through some statistics showing that actually it does work out statistically, that lives are saved. So I found that piece interesting. But before we get into more specifics on that, I just want to mention an overall interest in your work. How do you divide your time? You're known for this area. You've come at it from several different disciplines. And what sort of network or alliance do you build up with other people working in the field, and who all are they? Because I would imagine, it would be pediatricians working in an ER who see, a 15-year-old who tried to and or killed herself with a gun, all the way through to legislators. So what I'm trying to talk about is the sort of practical networking and impact you have in your field to bring change, besides doing the theoretical legwork and the statistics and all the rest of that. How does that all work out? In a way, I'm asking, how do you spend your day?
Yeah. So, I thought a lot about that when I decided what kind of a career I wanted to have, because I got a PhD in sociology, and, most people who are academic sociologists teach sociology and write articles that are read by sociologists. And I wanted to do something that I guess you could call it applied social science, which is there's this distinction between sociology in medicine and sociology of medicine. One is kind of a study of it as a thing, as a social phenomenon. You apply theories to that. Another one is sociology in medicine, where you're allied with people who come from different disciplines, and you come together and share what what each can contribute. And that's very much what I've done. So I'm in my academic home is the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Duke School of Medicine. As you mentioned earlier, I'm also an affiliate of a center in the law school, that is Science and Justice. But typically, I co-author papers, and I've published papers in law reviews and medical journals and social science journals and public health journals. And there are different perspectives around this. So I'll give you an example. I'm part of something called the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearm Policy that's now located at the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions. And, we have people trained in the law, and we have this sort of field that you might call public health law or legal epidemiology, that looks at the law as something that can be studied and used and to solve population health problems. We have people who are trained in clinical medicine, emergency doctors, who are also usually trained in public health. Public health tends to be a kind of an enclosure that can accommodate different people with different perspectives and areas of expertise. So what I guess the space where I have, and I mostly, to answer your question about how I spend my day, is I'm mostly a researcher. And the teaching that I do, formal teaching, is very little. I mean, I do some seminars for our, psychiatry residents, but most of the teaching I do is mentoring postdoctoral fellows who are junior members of our research teams, because this is a team sport. And and it takes money to do it, and it's funded by grants. And if we can, we'll get grants from the federal government. Otherwise, foundations will fund it. But we have research meetings, and then I spend time managing grants. Like, we have a big grant from the National Institute of Health right now. I have mentoring sessions. I give talks. I probably give a lot of talks. In September, I'm giving grand rounds at Johns Hopkins and at Temple, and then
How do those talks divide between the kind of teaching to people who are in the field, or what I would just call advocacy, as in, you show up and you're trying to get people to think in these terms. Just as a footnote, how do you divide that between advocacy,
Well,
you want to bring change, and or just supplying fellows who are studying with you
yeah.
with the facts?
Well, so I have to try to be careful and balance, um, you know, the advocacy part,
Mm-hmm.
and to kind of, if possible, keep it a little bit separate, because if I mean, one of the things that gives science credibility, social science credibility, is the idea that we're all operating according to the same set of rules about systematic observation of the world, and
Yeah.
we're going to let the data lead us where it goes. We're not going to start with an answer that we
Yeah.
already have and go backfill research for it. So, and when you're studying something that is very controversial, and in this case, partisan, is a third rail in the culture wars right now.
Yeah.
The language we use, and how we talk about it. And what I like to do is, here's the evidence. We're like, here is the evidence for whether a policy like, in mental health, outpatient civil commitment works, and what counts as what it works. Here is another policy called, psychiatric advance directive for people who are in mental health crisis.
Yeah.
And here is a policy called a risk protection order, which is a civil restraining order to temporarily remove firearms from people who are imminently dangerous. This is the results that we have from the studies that we've done, and be very transparent about that.
Yeah.
And yes, we can develop recommendations, but we want them to be evidence-based. And
Hmm.
we want to be honest about what we know, what we don't know, and also, try to shine some light on things that we think we know that ain't so. And there are things like that.
I've noticed that in your papers, as I've been reading through them, that when you get to what might be called the sort of political or advocacy part, you step back a little bit, and I could, tell what's going on. You just spelled it out. Here's the evidence, and then you sort of say something a little, not oblique exactly, but in the context of politics, or in the context of the controversies over gun, here are the facts I'm presenting. And it's hard to boil it down. You say something like, and it's hard to get something done about this, because of course the
Yeah.
context is nothing to do with just the objective facts. You're
Yeah.
arguing against a completely different belief system. But I have a question I want to throw in here,
Sure.
because you've been doing this for a while. It's been my experience with all sorts of things that when they become personal and close to you, sometimes opinions change. And it would seem to me that with 20,000 suicides a year, cutting across all social strata, politics, and so forth, let's just imagine someone who is a gun advocate, and they've got their AR-15, and they bought one for their kid on his 18th birthday, whatever, and they're all into this. And then they have an uncle, a father, a brother, a husband who commits suicide. Or they're part of a larger family unit that's devastated. When you're having 20,000 of these deaths a year, not to mention school shootings and all the rest of it, it would seem to me that there would be a growing number of Americans who personally have experienced tragedy very close to them, with a suicide and or someone they know got murdered with a gun, or a stray bullet hits a little girl. Eventually, is there a kind of I don't know how to do this, but is there a statistical reality here that eventually, in your head, does America run up against reality here and have to start doing things like the Swiss did? I grew up in Switzerland, by the way, spent 20 years there.
Yeah.
Removing the firearm from the younger men and finding something happening. So do you see any change out there unrelated to the politics and related to personal tragedy and experience that cuts home and says, similar to someone saying, hey, I was a homophobic asshole until I found out my daughter was a lesbian, and then I had to look at it again. That kind of a thing. Is there any of that going on? Because there's so much death and so much carnage. I can't help but think
Yeah.
at some point that shows up on the chart somewhere.
So yeah, it's interesting, because we talk about the United States as if it's one country, and it's incredibly diverse, and there is a huge variation from state to state in the severity of this problem and in what is being done about it.
Yeah.
And I remember, but these, when does gun violence seep into our national conversation and in our just our collective imagination? And it's after these horrific mass casualty shootings.
Sure.
I mean, the idea that somebody is going to go out with a AR-15 and just at random start massacring a bunch of strangers, that is a profoundly disturbing event for anybody, no matter what your politics are, to absorb that. And it's so disturbing, and it's so irrational, and it's just everything we don't want ordinary life to be. We want our lives to be safe and to be predictable and to make sense, and it's none of those things. So we want to get an answer to this. And why did this happen? And it's all kinds of complicated reasons. It's this deviant cultural script that young men are curating and following. But the answer we get in the public square is often, it's mental illness, fixed mental illness. These people are crazy, so they make a convenient, people with mental illness make a convenient scapegoat, because this resonates with what lots of people already believe.
Sure.
But actually, the fact is that serious mental illness, these diseases that affect the brain's ability to reason and regulate mood, contribute very little to the overall problem of gun violence. If we cured schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and major depression, overall violence would go down by about 4%, and the rest of it would still be there. So, so after one of these horrible shootings, probably the worst, it's kind of ground zero for this, was the Sandy Hook Elementary School, in 2012. And that's when we had this big summit and so on. I thought that, yes, something's going to happen at the federal level. And yet it did not. They did not even pass universal background checks. Well, there's a really interesting phenomenon there. So, you ask people, do you think it's a good idea that if somebody's going to buy a gun, that there should be a check to make sure that they're not a convicted felon, that they're actually legally eligible to purchase that gun? Everybody says that's a great idea. Large majorities of people, gun owners across the spectrum. Then you later in the same questionnaire, you say, well, the United States Senate voted on that, and your senator voted against it. Do you agree with your senator? Well, you think you'd get an answer, a perfect correlation between that second answer and the first one. You don't. They're not the same question, because the first one is about, is this a good idea to save lives? And the second one is about what tribe you belong to, because if you're a Republican and your senator voted against it, then you're for that senator's view. So we have the same thing happen with these risk protection order laws. Where large majorities of people, gun owners and non-gunners alike, say it's a good idea that police officers should have clear legal authority with a judge's order, with due process, to temporarily remove firearms from people who are imminently dangerous.
And then or wife abusers or whatever.
Yeah, and everybody thinks that's a good idea. It doesn't affect the gun rights of law-abiding gun owners at all. It's not gun control. In fact, you say, what, if you think that people don't kill people, guns don't kill people, people do, well, here's a tool to help you figure out who those people are. But then you take that same policy and you put it into a bill and you try to get it passed in a legislature with a Republican governor and a supermajority of Republicans in the state house, and it goes to the committee of no return immediately, because it's now about politics. And I think we need to get beyond that. So you asked this question like, well, does this somehow move people? Well, there's so much misinformation out there that, lots and lots of people in this country think, yes, we have a problem with gun violence. The solution to it is we need more guns in the hands of more people in more places so we can all defend ourselves. And the NRA has been assiduous to try to, tell people this. So, and evidence be damned, a lot of people believe that to be true. And if that's so, it's like we need a change in how we think about it. Look at some other country, in Western Europe or UK, whatever, and they have young intoxicated knuckleheads who get in a fight in the middle of the night over somebody's girlfriend coming out of a pub. What happens? Somebody gets a black eye or a bloody nose. In our country, same scenario, young men at night, an argument escalates, it's statistically more likely that one of those young men is going to have a handgun and is going to
Yeah.
use it. Somebody's going to get dead, or maybe two people. That's baked into our homicide rates, and it doesn't have to be that way. But we need a change in how we think about gun safety, like we think about car safety differently now.
Yeah, of course. And we did seat belts, and we managed to,
Yeah.
have driving lessons for young people. They can't just jump in a car, and it doesn't. And that's another one of those things that if you use it as an example with someone in the non-political context of not how did your congressperson vote on this, oh yeah, well, of course. But then you translate it into the political context, and then it's part of the culture war. I'm just going to reintroduce you here a second. This is In Conversation with
Sure.
Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Professor Jeff Swanson. And this is, I don't want to embarrass you, but I think you would be regarded as a leader in the field of scientific approach, psychiatric approach to this issue, as well as because of your position in a law school, trying to correlate the psychiatric, the legislative, and the legal aspects all in one life and career. That's kind of how, at least from going through all the papers you've written, or many of them, that's what I got from that, this kind of interdisciplinary look at it. So maybe this is a weird way to put it, because who wants to be this person? But you kind of maybe the number one expert on gun violence in America, if there was one person to choose. And I think you're it, Jeff, which is an unhappy thing to be. Tough thing. Speaking of psychological balance and happiness, we could get into that. It's a hard neighborhood to work in all your life. So we're talking today about various papers Jeff has written, and we started getting into this through a personal story. I want to change gears for a minute here and just ask you a different question. I come from a missionary background as well. My dad became a very famous evangelical theologian. So just off the subject for a minute, what denomination sent him as a medical missionary out? What was who was he with?
So he grew up in an evangelical denomination called the Evangelical Covenant Church. It's a sort of has a Swedish immigrant,
sure,
Lutheran background,
yeah.
But it's a covenant. It's now sort of mainstream evangelical, but he was with a non-denominational evangelical mission that was known as HCJB because they had a radio station, otherwise known as the World Radio Missionary Fellowship. And but they had a medical arm, and they had two hospitals and other programs. And so that was, but he believed that, and my mom did too, and she was a missionary as well, that their work in healing people and helping people was very intertwined with their Christian mission.
Yeah.
And I wrote a book about that too.
A book about what aspect were you dealing with in your book?
So the book is called Echoes of the Call, and the subtitle is Identity and Ideology Among American Missionaries in Ecuador. And it's Oxford University Press, 1995, and it's a book that was based on my doctoral dissertation at Yale. And I was interested. I was, at the time I wrote it, I was a young man trying to do the identity work of figuring out, this background that I'd come from and what motivated my parents. And now I was, in this much more, pluralistic, secular, much broader academic intellectual context. And so I wanted to use my intellectual tools as a sociologist to study that world and to understand not only the motivation, but how the missionaries there used language, rhetoric, storytelling, and their own sense of strangerhood in the world, which is a very, nuanced kind of theme that is both personal and social, to make sense of their world. And so I gathered all kinds of Christian testimonies and testimonies of divine calling, and those are all in this book. But I ended up taking, I had two specialties in sociology. One was sociology of religion, and then the other was sociology of medicine, health and illness, and psychiatric epidemiology. And I ended up going that direction. But you know, I still have, you know, these habits of mind of thinking about, you know, how do people's religious affiliations and their own way of thinking about the world and asking, you know, ultimate questions, and how does that relate to everything else that's going on that I'm studying, you know? And so it's a, you know, it's a, I mean, it's a rich and complex way of thinking about it, but I don't regret it.
Yeah, it seems to me, I don't know what your journey was subsequently to those years you spent there, and then by the time you were writing a book about it, how you look back on it and how you're, you know, further on that path.
Yeah.
You know, I left the sort of theological mindset, but one thing I did not leave was, although I kind of resent it looking back, was this idea that the salvation of the world sort of depended on us in as a child in the mission and how you behaved, and we had to, you know, introduce these people to Jesus, et cetera, et cetera. And how you lived made a difference. But the funny thing is, that sort of stuck with me is a sense of outreach and zeal for whatever I am into. And it kind of, you can take the missionary child out of the mission, but can you take that kind of zealousness out? And it seems to me, and I don't want to put words
Yeah.
in your mouth, but you're, you know, you brought up your background. The single-mindedness in your papers that I've been reading and the way you have pursued this with the sense of injustice that has to be righted because people are dying who don't need to. If it wasn't for the tens of
Yeah.
millions of dollars being spent by the gun lobby, you know, you're up against something that in my parents' terms would have been called evil, and you're still fighting it. Now you're kind of in a weird way, and I you know, in a funny sort of sense, I'm sort of thinking that that kind of zealousness is what certainly motivated my parents to go out and quote save the lost. But it's, you know, it's the reason why there's a lot of hospitals around with names like St. Mary,
Sure.
and both from the Catholic side, you know, thinking of the one in Rochester, Minnesota, or others. So just to take a kind of a time out from this, how do you see your own life and this kind of call, if I can put it that way,
Yeah.
to save the life of people who are going to kill themselves and or all the other insane gun violence, or for that matter, my grandchildren at school, who should feel safe? You know, do you think it's coincidental that you've wound up in a lifetime of work to save life, to do good, to bring justice, and to make the quality of our life in America closer to the kind of thing that maybe your parents would have described as an ideal when it comes to just interpersonal relationships and how we care for each other?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a coincidence at all. And you're not the first person who's observed that about what I do, that to see it as analogous to a mission
Yeah,
and a call, you know. Um, of course, you know, when Max Weber wrote The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and talked a lot about this idea of a call, and a calling is kind of baked into Protestant culture because
sure.
everyone can have a call. It's this sense um, of something beyond myself that I'm committed to, and it's both individual, but it also can be serving. So I think that's probably true, and it's probably, you know, I just remember this job interview I had when I was first starting out. I had gotten my PhD, and I had a job interview at it was a, you know, a small college with a good reputation. And I remember the chair interviewed me, and he had my dissertation just sitting there right between himself and me, like an orphan child, and he had read some of it.
Yeah,
And he said, well, let me ask you a question. He said, I've come from kind of a neo-Marxist perspective, and he said, I read your chapter on Max Weber where you talk about calling, but he said, have you read Randall Collins's article on Weber's Last Theory of Capitalism? And I hadn't read it. And not only that, he had this kind of fake British accent, and I thought he said Weber's Lost Theory of Capitalism instead
yeah.
of Last. And I said, I was kind of a smart ass. I said, well, I didn't even know it was missing. And
That's great.
then, and then he said, well, let me ask you another question. Do you read German? And I said, well, I don't. He said, well, that explains a lot, because, you know, you haven't even read Max Weber in the original German, and you and a lot of other American sociologists, you don't realize he's a lot closer to Marx than you think, and all that. And I'm saying, do I really want to spend my life in a department with this guy writing about these esoteric ideas that are going to be read by him and maybe two editors and my mother, or do I want to do something that's going to matter to people's lives,
Yeah.
And I didn't get the job, but it's a moment where I realized I want to be someone out there. And it is kind of fun because if you work in an interdisciplinary context with, a bunch of doctors, you can say things sometimes it would be perfectly obvious to any sociologist, and they think you're a genius. You came up that way. But that's what's great about interdisciplinary work, But just a very quick story about that. My first job was in a medical school. Here I am. I'm a sociologist. I'm thinking about, here are these doctors, and my dad was a doctor, and the director of the residency training program took me aside. He said, well, I don't know what you do exactly, but you seem like a smart fellow. Could you organize a month of our Tuesday academic programs with a resident in psychiatry? And I said, sure. And it can be anything you want. And so what I chose is I said, why don't we do something on religion and psychiatry? Because, here are these people that are coming in to see these psychiatry residents. They come from all over the world. They don't understand each other very well. And so we're going to do that. A couple of days later, the resident who I was working with called me, and he said, I have a great case to present, because we had to present a case. And he said, it's this lady, and this is my first experience with violence and mental illness, that the police have brought her into the emergency department. I was on call, and she seemed they picked her up at a church service. And the police were called. She's at the church service, and she was flailing lead pipe at the pastor, attacking the pastor. So she seemed really psychotic, and I admitted her as psychosis not otherwise specified. He said, the weird thing is, when I went back to see her the next day, she's perfectly sane. She knows where she is. She doesn't seem like she's mentally at all, but she has a particular account. She said, the reason that happened is that I was at a service of deliverance from a demon, and I have a demon that is possessing me. And about the time the pastor was going to cast the demon out, the demon was unhappy about that and used my body to pick up this pipe. And all of a sudden, this just kicked in, because I grew up believing in demon possession, reading the Bible, and I thought that'd be very interesting. So we organized this panel discussion, and we invited the pastor to come to talk about his perspective on it. Because, one person thought it was due to dissociation disorder, or someone else thought it was atypical psychosis or something. So I invite the pastor, and he was, you would recognize this character. He was kind of out of central casting from East Texas. And he came in, and I told him he had 10 minutes to speak. It's an amphitheater with all of these people in white coats. And he walks up there with a Bible, and he says, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to begin by reading a passage of scripture. And I'll bet you recognize the passage. He said, and the passage from the Bible is, you wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers of the air. Yeah. And all of you people who are training to be psychiatrists, if you think you can understand this violent act that this woman engaged in by understanding just her brain and her mind, you're wrong. The human life is a crucible struggle between evil and good, between Satan and God, and sometimes Satan wins. And he goes on, and he went on for 15 minutes. Finally, I had to cut him off, and I had to say something to synthesize it. And what I said was, we've heard a lot of different ideas about this behavior. But if all of you who are trained to be psychiatrists and are psychiatrists and mental health professionals, if you conclude that this lady is mentally ill, and your evidence for that is her unusual belief in demon possession, then you have to conclude that Pastor Jones here is equally mentally ill, and everybody in the church is too, because they all believe the same thing. Yeah. Right? You take her out of context. And so that was the kind of thing where I brought my two worlds together. They kind of collided there, right? Yeah. Because I understood where that was coming from. And yet, it looked very pathological in that setting. And that's a little bit off the tangent, but that was one of my first, I really wanted to think about, how do we understand this connection between what's happening in the mind and the brain and life story and behavior that can be very harmful.
Well, and the context of belief. And I think that actually has a very, very direct impact on your work in terms of gun violence.
Sure.
Because, of course, it's the same thing that happens when you say to someone, as you brought up a few minutes ago, you think it would be a good idea to do some background checks and prevent a girl who's tried to commit suicide 3 times from now buying a handgun to do it right, quote unquote. They say, yeah, that's a great idea, but your senator voted against it, and suddenly it comes down. It's exactly the same thing. As soon as it becomes part of MAGA Nation or the Trump thing or the Republican Party, and that's a good segue to a question. I made myself a little note here. Maybe this is a stretch for you, but what do you think that the belief system is, speaking of that lady and her pastor, that has perpetuated the support of what I'll just say is gun violence in America, from not just the extreme right and Christian nationalists or whatever, and who are into gun ownership, but more recently from the majority on the Supreme Court, which wanted to curtail this ability of New York State to control gun violence in New York City, and many other aspects of open carry and all the rest. So what I'm talking about is, you've got this pastor with his Bible, believes in demon possession. That's the context in which she picks up a lead pipe. And if she's crazy, to use the layman's term, he is too. So it's the whole congregation. It was a great point. So you got to look at it differently. What's happening when it comes to Amy Coney Barrett and the rest of the court? Because weirdly, most of these folks come out of a conservative religious background themselves, and they see these issues in terms of not just politics, but right and wrong. Even as in, we're willing to put up with a certain number of collateral damage deaths, school shootings, suicides, whatever, to maintain this higher principle of constitutionality, which is their argument.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to be the same thing. It's like, which lens are you looking through? Because within their framework, does that sort of make sense? I mean, if you're going to accept 50,000 deaths a year with gun violence and suicides combined.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm fascinated by the question. I mean, you're asking me to drive a little bit outside my lane here, because I'm
maybe more political than you want to be, because next time you present a paper, it's like, no, see, Jeff said on this podcast, yes, he believed, so maybe you have to disagree with me to get your paper.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a doctor. I'm a pretty good dilettante. But anyway, but you don't have to be an expert to observe that the court has become more partisan in recent years, given the story behind these appointments. And you can look at, you just alluded, I think, to the Bruin decision. Just to talk about that landscape for a minute. 200 years of jurisprudence around the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, and nobody ever thought that it conferred an individual right for a person to own a gun. But along came the Heller decision, Heller versus DC.
Yeah,
and in 2008, and that was what was established. It's interesting because there was a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine by a guy named Colin Lofton and his colleagues, and he showed that that when the District of Columbia enacted this very restrictive handgun licensing law that effectively made handguns, not licensable, so it amounted to a handgun ban. They calculated, in quite a compelling statistical analysis, that it saved 42 lives every year. And that data, that paper was presented in the briefs to the Supreme Court in the Heller decision.
Yeah.
You'd think that the 42 lives, that'd be the headline. The headline is, no, the Supreme Court decides that that's not constitutional. It doesn't matter. And so that was that decision. Now, of course, Justice Scalia, in his opinion, also said, and that's this part often isn't recognized, that the right is not unlimited, and left in place some of the major restrictions on owning if you're a felon and involuntarily committed to hospital. But now you move along to Bruin, and yes, it was a decision about this law licensed in New York. But what's had a bigger impact is the opinion there that changed the whole methodology for lower courts to evaluate constitutional challenges to the Second Amendment. It used to be there was this two-part test, like, okay, does this implicate the Second Amendment? Does it involve a compelling government interest, like saving lives? And if so, is it narrowly tailored? And that's the door through which you can bring research evidence and say, yeah, look, this saves lives, and it doesn't affect a lot of others. Now, that's not the thing. All we have to do now is it's called text, history, and tradition. We have to try to figure out what James Madison was thinking, or, and these paragons of virtue who thought that, women were property and black people actually were property, but they somehow have this privileged view on what we're supposed to do now. And it's kind of what you might call selective originalism, because it's originalism when it lines up with a political view that the Supreme Court's, and I'm just, pontificating here a little bit. This is not my research, but it's my observation. That really, and this created a kind of a chaotic situation with all these cases in the lower courts trying to figure out, well, what did they mean by that? And then
if we don't actually care about the human life anymore, then we got to
right.
Then what's the point?
It's like this. Somehow, the right to walk around with a gun, existed in the mind of God before the Constitution. It's somehow this thing that takes on this incredible, and evangelicals who are like of the Christian nationalist variety, who didn't really care about guns that much, now they really do, because it's one of those things that you got to believe if you're in that group.
So it's interesting that we're having this discussion at a moment when we're coming up to another election, and the crazy thing is, just to use a personal analogy, before when Hillary Clinton was going to be president, and I had been interviewed a number of times on all sorts of media outlets because I'm the son of this evangelical leader. And, but then, and I wrote a memoir, Crazy for God, and it got a lot of traction. And then those died down for a while. And I was so relieved because I wrote a book about my son being in the Marine Corps, and I wrote a book about some other things, and I wrote a fourth novel, and it was like, good. I can get on with it. Okay, here I am, 72 years old. And it's like, it's not only back where I started, I'm finishing up my life trying to explain who, quote, these people are all over again on this podcast and in interviews, and some people making a documentary, trying to track how this all came about all the way up to the January 6th thing and all the rest of it. And, my life is completely enmeshed and ensnared in questions related to the beginnings of the religious right 50 years ago that my family was part of, that I thought I would outlive. And it just seems to me that we'll see what happens in November, very selfishly, in addition to politically hoping that Kamala Harris is elected for the reasons that I think most Democrats would hold. On a selfish level, it's like, how many times do I have to go through this loop again? And it seems to me you're sort of stuck in the same position because you've given your life and on this mission to try to bring some sanity of facticity to a field that suddenly becomes a woman with a lead pipe seeing demons, because it's nothing to do with everything evangelicals say they're about, which is love and kindness and human life and all the rest. And I remember days, it would have been unthinkable to Billy Graham say at a meeting with him in 1970, if we had said, the big issue evangelicals have to stand for is the ownership of semi-automatic weapons. Right. I mean, he would have said, what are you talking about? That's not our message.
Yeah, no, it's that's my least favorite part of the Bill of Rights, where James Madison wrote that the right of a troubled young man to buy an AR-15 without a background check shall not be infringed.
Yeah.
Doesn't actually say that.
It doesn't say that.
It does. Yeah.
How do you interpret the Second Amendment? I'm just interested because you do all this. How do you see it for real outside of the political context? What did they actually mean? Because obviously it's not open carry at political rallies to intimidate people or bump stocks. What did they mean? I mean, for real, what did it mean?
Well,
if they meant anything.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what it meant. The context was so different back then. The weapons were different, and so I think it probably had to do with with the well-ordered militia, not so much an individual person who has this constitutionally guaranteed right to have a gun for personal protection. But it doesn't really matter what it meant, because where I sit now is that this is the context in which, it would be nice if we could just start with a blank sheet of paper and a bunch of smart people and say, let's do what works. And we might decide, like all of our peer high income countries and, that we've talked about, they might look at this and we might, just like they do, and we would say the idea that everybody should have guns and walk around with guns is just too damn dangerous. So we're going to broadly limit legal access to guns as a public safety measure. And so we can't
just
do
like
that.
we do with driver's licenses or anything else.
So we cannot do that. We cannot broadly limit legal access to guns. I mean, those countries say, well, we're going to limit legal access to guns and then make some exceptions on the margins for people who have a good reason to have a gun, and it's highly regulated, maybe a gun club and stuff. But here we do just the opposite. We say, you have this right, and then we try to make some exceptions on the margins for really dangerous people, but we don't know who they are. We have to figure out who are the people who are so dangerous that it is justified to override a constitutional right. And that's very hard to do because people are complicated. Gun violence is a very complicated behavior. It's caused by lots of different things that interact with each other in complex ways. Mm-hmm. And all the risk factors for violence are non-specific, which means they apply to many more people who are not going to do the thing you're trying to prevent than who are. Two of the strongest risk factors for gun violence and violence in general are what? Being young and being male. What's that do? Are we going to round them all up? No. So, we have a very challenging problem in this country, given the fact that we have 300, 500 million guns, more guns than people. And they're so entrenched in our culture, particularly in some areas of the country.
Well, in addition to which, and you kind of made reference to this, but in the reading I've done on the subject, you have this insane advertising initiative from gun manufacturers to try to equate, quote, real manhood with gun ownership, that you're going to be this protector. And what kind of gun? Well, AR-15 with a big magazine or a bump stock and so forth. So it isn't a level playing field. No one else is spending hundreds of millions of dollars from the other side to try to protect the girl who's about to blow her brains out with the shotgun. Yeah. It's all to make young men who are doing all the young men things feel like they need a gun. And that's new. So when people say, well, it's a mental illness thing because of lack of the spirituality or less people in church or, they're whatever, this wasn't happening in the 1950s or 60s. No, because the gun lobby was not advertising AR-15s to young men saying, this is your rite of passage.
Yeah, we're never going to live in a world where we don't have some people inclined to harm others or themselves. But we shouldn't have to tolerate living in a society where people at a moment like that have such easy access to such an efficient killing technology that's designed to kill a bunch of people with very minimal physical effort. Yeah. And, and when you think about balancing risk and rights, given the way the Supreme Court has interpreted the right to bear arms, this is the information we're putting in the hands of legislators. Yeah. At the state level, and a lot of it is happening at the state level. I mean, I'm not that hopeful at the federal level, but we did get the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and we had some input into that, and I got to go to the White House, for that ceremony. But if you look at it a little bit more positively, more people in this country now live in a state with stronger and more sensible gun laws than was the case when the Sandy Hook shooting occurred. Yeah. And there are certain kinds of states and not other kinds of states. There are some states where, there's a lot that's really to celebrate about solving this problem. And just to mention this one policy that we've worked on quite a bit called the ERPO, or the Extreme Risk Protection Order, or the Red Flag Law. It's a solution that is kind of tailor-made for our country, because other countries wouldn't need this. But it's about risk. It's not about mental illness per se. Yeah. It's about behavioral indicators of risk. There's due process. The state has the burden of proving in a court of law that this person poses a risk. and it's temporary, and it's not criminalizing. And it could be, we're worried about Uncle Floyd. You know, he's bereaved and he's drinking heavily and he has 6 shotguns.
Yeah.
And, you know, just preventing him from buying another one isn't going to help. You might need an intervention where we actually remove those guns for a while. Police look into it. They have to swear out this affidavit. In Connecticut, a state's attorney looks at it, a judge decides. So there's plenty of due process, but it might save that person's life. If you're in a state that doesn't have a law like that, you call the police, they might say, well, you know, is he a convicted felon? No. Well, has he been involuntarily hospitalized in a mental hospital? No. You know, is he, you know, mentally incompetent or criminally? Well, no. Well, then call us back when he does something, and it might be too late, you know?
Yeah.
So what we've showed with this research, and the newest paper confirms this with our statistical models, is that for every, let's just say a range, but, you know, 15 to 20 or so of these gun removal actions that are temporary, one life is saved. So then you ask yourself, is that high or low? And it may depend on where you're standing. You know, if you're someone who cares more about the Second Amendment right than any other damn thing in the world, you might say that's unacceptable. And people do tell me that. Like, what about these other people? You took their guns away and they wouldn't necessarily have died anyway or done anything. But if you're someone like me and you have a story like Kristen or my other 2 relatives who died, or my colleague who is a professor of epidemiology, then you think, yeah, you know what, that is an appropriate balance between risk and rights. And you know, it's in every treatment in medicine has something like that. Like, not everybody is going to benefit from it. A lot of people get side effects. So you have to balance out, how bad are those side effects?
Yeah, and again, if it wasn't so politicized, we would see the sense of that, in the same way that, you know, I don't burn with resentment every time I see a police car at an underpass with a speed trap and notice everybody slowing down, because statistically, if there was no speed trap at all ever anywhere, instead of 48,000 or 50,000 deaths a year on our roads, it would double, because we would know, you know, well, what about the guy that's, you know, stopped for no reason? Well, you know, that the 10,000 cars that passed that car that was pulled over in the last 10 minutes on I-95, you've established the fact that it isn't open season on the freeway.
Right.
I mean, we let it, this happens in every other area of life. Again,
and also, we don't say, when there is a fatal crash and somebody was driving 95 miles an hour, we don't say, well, obviously we don't need speed limits because that person they ignored it and they drove 95 miles an hour.
They're mentally ill or they're drunk. We need more.
We don't say, but people do say that if there's a mass shooting that occurs in a state that has a red flag law that's been used maybe 10 times, they say, look, it doesn't work.
It didn't work.
It's not going to work unless it's implemented. And otherwise, you might as well just take your new bill and roll it up in a bottle and throw it in the ocean. Hope somebody finds it.
There's a lot of credit for any progress being made in this area goes to my guest today. And we'll wrap this up in a minute. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest has been Jeff Swanson, PhD, who has written, you know, I was starting to Google and prepare for this a while back, and Ernie sent me some things, and essentially I read a lot of stuff about you and by you, but it's huge. It's a, you know, if you bound all these papers into a book, you'd have a library. There's so much, but Jeff, it's been a real pleasure, and I would just say that, you know, please do for us what our friend from the New York Times did in recommending you. We're interested in this subject, and whether it's somebody's story or an unrelated thing that you think we would have a good podcast discussing, please, when I ring off here, as it were, stick around for a minute and talk to Ernie, my producer, and see if we can't find some more, because this is something that I posted a lot about myself. Every time there's any kind of a you know, another shooting or whatever, you know, I'm always exercised by it. Just as someone that does childcare for 3 of my grandchildren, you know, there's many a time when I've been at school pickup waiting there soon after the news of another school shooting or something, and I'm really, it's personal every single time. I mean, you know, and I think it is for so many people that we got to make that connection, and you're spending your life working on that. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer at Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, It Has to Be Said. at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And Jeff, come back and talk to us some more. And please send us some more guests, because this is not an issue that we should only do one podcast on. We'll keep addressing this.
I will do that. And there are many colleagues who have worked with me on this, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to have this conversation with you, Frank. It's been
and if you want to do
pleasure.
a panel or do something more, bring somebody along, please keep in touch with Ernie, because this is as big as it gets. This is huge.
Thank you.
And again, it's humbling to talk to you, because you're giving your expertise and your brains to something worthwhile. It's really something. I mean, this is a big one. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Frank. Okay, I'll stick around.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks.